Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Chris McAllister from the Harmonie Club. I'm so pleased to see so many members logged in for our virtual session, Wine Masterclasses, the 6 Noble Grapes, Part 1, where we'll be tackling the noble red grapes tonight. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, I will be muting everyone during the presentation. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the program using the chat feature in the Zoom toolbar or by using the hand-raising feature. And I'll call on you if the time is right. I'll unmute you. We also will have a Q&A session at the conclusion of tonight's presentation for everyone to participate in. Feel free to keep your video on or off, whatever you're most comfortable with. This session is going to be recorded and will be added to our virtual Clubhouse resources on our website. We did partner with West Coast Wines on Lexington Avenue in New York City to make sure that tonight's wine selections were available to our members. West Coast Wines does deliver within New York City, and most of the wines for tonight's program and next week's session can be ordered on wine.com as well. Tonight, I'm so excited to welcome Olivia Morevec. Olivia Morevec's on the call to talk to us about the Noble Red Grapes. Olivia became a certified sommelier level 2 through the Court of Master Sommeliers, adding wine director to her title that same year when she was only 24 years old. She was also named an FSR magazine's 40 under 40 restaurant stars on the rise. After working in other major U.S. cities, Olivia moved to New York City, where she became the dining room manager of the 3 Michelin star restaurant 11 Madison Park, which we all know. And at that time, the 11 Madison Park was rated #1 in the world by Pellegrino's 100 Best Restaurants in the World. Olivia's love of wine led her to join the team at Skurnik Wines, and that's how we connected. And without further ado, please welcome Olivia Morevec. Olivia, thank you so much for being here tonight.
So as Chris mentioned, we did partner with West Coast Wines on the Upper East Side. So if you guys weren't able to get the wines for tonight, they will still be there. So feel free to listen to the tasting notes and to the tastings of the wines. And if anything catches your ear, then step on over and you can still grab them. They'll be available through the next couple weeks. Pardon?
And they do delivery.
And they do delivery, yes. So tonight we're tackling 4 red wines that we'll be tasting. Next week there are another 4 white wines. But tonight we're just going to be talking about the 3 noble red varietals. So a fun place to start. So just to give you guys an idea of what a noble grape is, this is kind of a little bit of an argued subject, if you will. Originally, noble grapes were kind of brought around to be thought of as an international varietal. So when we think about grapes like Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Merlot, I bet you all can think of at least 3 places around the world that they're grown. Not just France, not just the United States, but they're really grown in many countries. So when the idea of noble grapes were brought up, it was really about kind of the internationalization of these grape varietals. Throughout time, there's been a spread of other grapes as well. So whichever somms you talk to, there could be up to 18 noble grape varietals at this point. But today we're just going to talk about the core 6, which were originally kind of the first that spread to most of the countries that we consider to be the New World countries. So I'll throw that term around a couple times tonight. So I just want to let you know what it means before we get too deep into things. If you think about Old World versus New World, Old World, of course, is going to be your European wines. So kind of where wine originated: France, Italy, Spain, Germany, Italy, and all of that area. Once you move outside of Europe, then we're talking South Africa, United States, Canada even, Australia, South America. All these are considered New World because there weren't originally Vitis vinifera grape varietals that were grown there. And Vitis vinifera is where we get our fine wine from. You can make wine out of other grapes like Concord grapes, but it doesn't usually taste very good. So these grapes have kind of become internationalized. And so we're going to tackle the main three reds this evening and the main three whites next Tuesday night at 6 o'clock. The cool thing about diving into individual grape varietals is you can really, whether it's blind tasting or just being able to tell somebody, what characteristics you like in a wine, once you've kind of figured out what characteristics each grape has, you can better verbalize the wines that you like or the characteristics that you like and maybe be introduced into something new. Or even when you're drinking something you don't like, it's easier for you to be able to verbalize what you don't enjoy about a wine. So all of those things help whoever you're drinking with or whoever your sommelier is, or maybe even Chris, help you pick a better wine for your palate based on what you enjoy about Pinot Noir or what you enjoy about Cabernet Sauvignon. So really great to know these grapes and know your relationship with each grape varietal. One other note, some places do have noble grapes just based on the region. I think Alsace is one of the most famous in the world where they have 4 noble, what they call noble grape varietals for that region. So that's another way that the term noble grapes are used, is geographically. So when we think about Alsace, they would say Riesling is one of our noble grape varietals, or Gewürztraminer is one of our noble grape varietals, even though that isn't an internationalized grape varietal. So just something to know. So the 6 grapes that we're going to be talking about are Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Merlot, Chardonnay, Riesling, and Sauvignon Blanc. So tonight we'll tackle the first 3. But before we get there, all of those varietals actually have French descendants. So I think it's really interesting to think about why are those grapes the ones that have spread internationally and have become the most famous grape varietals. Most fine wine history does begin in France. If you think about any movies that you hear people talking about fine wines, they're usually ordering Grand Cru Burgundy or First Growth Bordeaux or Sauternes, and a lot of those fine wines come from Bordeaux and from Burgundy. There's also the trade routes that played a really huge role for royalty getting their wines. And of course, everybody wants to be drinking what royalty is drinking. So it's important to think about where the routes were taking travelers and taking explorations and trading routes in order to get wine from point A to point B. So in this case, Burgundy is actually off that beaten path, and we'll explore that a little bit later. But when we think about places like Bordeaux, that's in the dead center of a river where people are bringing in trades all of the time. And so a great way to globalize a grape varietal or globalize a wine to make it something that is wanted or luxury around the world. So historically, these grape varietals have been the center of solidifying new regions in the New World. Some of the first grapes that were brought over to the New World were actually brought into Mexico when explorations came to the Western Hemisphere. At that time, it was the mission grape, which nobody really drinks at this point unless you're drinking a lot of Chilean wine, as it's a very popular grape varietal there called País. But the spread of this did come to America, but nobody really caught on to the mission because it wasn't making fine wine. So really, it's these kind of fine wine grape varietals that solidified the grape regions that we know today, like Napa Valley, Willamette Valley, Burgundy. These are the famous grape varietals that solidified those areas. The other way that we think about luxury wine, though, is also about place. So I don't want to overlook the idea that even though some of the famous grape varietals haven't been internationalized, they are still associated with luxury wines. They just haven't been traded as widely. So you can think about Nebbiolo or Sangiovese. They're definitely grown in other places, but not as well as you find in Tuscany or in Barolo, which is why they're fine wines in that area. And if you buy a Sangiovese that's grown somewhere else, it's probably not as good quality. The cool thing about the 3 grape varietals we're exploring today is that they really can grow in a number of different regions and countries, which is what makes them noble grapes. So today, the most planted grapes in the world do include these grapes, but they also include some really not thought of as the most popular grapes in the world, like Tempranillo. But all of those are typically still grown in Spain. It's just that they have so much space to grow that's why they're taking up the most amount of land. But internationally, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, Merlot are the best well-known varietals. Okay, Burgundy, some of my favorite wine in the world. So Pinot Noir comes from a little place called Burgundy in France. When we think about Burgundy, I think a lot of people think about really expensive Pinot Noir, really fine wine, but really this is a place where monks were, and it's just farmland. And now that the wine that is coming out of there is such high quality, is where it's turned into a luxury good. So they were originally recorded there. Their Pinot Noir was originally recorded there, and Pinot Noir is a grape varietal. It's notoriously hard to grow. So it took a little bit of time to find other areas in the world that could actually grow that same grape varietal. So California was really the first place that took on that grape varietal outside of Europe after the spread of grape varietals. Cistercian monks spent so much time cultivating the land that they were some of the first ones to map out a full region and rate their pieces of land. So we'll dive into that a little bit with one of the bottles that we're tasting today. But they were so meticulous about harvesting their land and making sure that they were dividing what was best and bottling those wines together to make a better wine. It was like the king gets these best vineyards, right? And then, the jesters get this amount of vineyard, and then the common folk get your average land. It's kind of how they first started breaking it up. And that is an idea that's carried through for centuries now, both in Burgundy as well as Bordeaux. So they believed that labor brought them closer to God, so they really worked hard on this wine, and they really worked hard on making a very good wine instead of getting money. So Bordeaux, you can think of money. They're there to make money on their wine. They use very expensive barrels. Their land is very expensive. Their chateaus are very large, and they often sell their wine up to a year in advance to the importers or to whoever. But it is well known that Bordeaux is very, very expensive. Burgundy, however, was really brought up as a farmland, and they were just focused so much on quality. So that's why Pinot Noir now is associated with quality as well as scarcity. I think Burgundy still has that kind of air about it where it's hard to find, and it's still very it's unattainable, which makes everybody want it a little bit more. So how did we get Pinot Noir in the United States? So as I mentioned before, European vines were brought over to Mexico back in the 1600s. But here in America, we have this terrible little disease or root louse called phylloxera. So it's this tiny bug that goes down into the roots and infects the rootstock of a grape varietal and kills the vines. So we did something awful as Americans. We took this root louse over to Europe and started a mass infection of phylloxera all over the world. So not only did grapes not survive in the United States, but we also took this little root louse over to Europe, which is still wreaking havoc all over the world at this point on grape varietals. But it took a long time to figure out how to grow Vitis vinifera in the United States because we have this little pest. Eventually, we found out that you have to graft your vines onto the rootstock of American vines. So, for example, when we think about Concord grapes, it's a different grape varietal. But if you take that root, then you can attach the vine of a European vine and then plant that and have it grow. So this is kind of how we combated that. And now most places in the world have to combat it the same way, unfortunately. So a lot of people are using different rootstocks. So if you ever hear pre-phylloxera, then it means that they're still on their own rootstock, which is it's a very special thing. So we couldn't really have grapes here for a while because we couldn't figure out how to do it. And then finally in the 1850s, we got it right. We brought Pinot Noir over to California. Next thing you know, it's planted in New Zealand. And then following that, about 110 years later, we got to Oregon. So the spread was kind of slow when you really think about the expansion of the United States and our wine culture versus France. France, it's been there. We talked about it. It's been there since the monks. They've got it down. And then if we look at over here in the United States, 1965 was the first Pinot Noir that was planted in Oregon. It's not that long ago. So when we think about the United States wine trade, we did get Pinot Noir back in the 1850s, but when we went through Prohibition, that took a huge chunk out of our vines. People stopped tending to them. We took another dip to where we weren't making any wine anymore unless it was for sacrificial use. So our fine wine went away. And then it really came back up post-Prohibition. So that's why you see all of our fine wines happening in the 1900s for the first time. Okay. So finally, 1959, even before Oregon, we get Finger Lakes Pinot Noir as well. And 1980s New Zealand wine industry is finally recognized as not bulk wine and an actual fine wine region. So I already mentioned that Pinot Noir is a challenging grape varietal to grow. It really is fickle in the sense that it needs the perfect conditions to grow and to ripen. If you guys have ever had unripe grapes on a bunch, you know they're kind of sour and not very tasty. Same thing can happen to your Pinot Noir when you're ripening it, and if it doesn't get ripe enough, then you're not going to have very good wine or wine at all. So there's a little map here on the slideshow that kind of shows you that it's called the Pinot Noir belt. And it's basically between, I think, the 37th and the 50th parallels. But you can kind of use this as a guideline as where Pinot Noir grows well, which is why we see it at the top of California and Oregon. It's right across from where Burgundy is. You can also find good Pinot Noir grown in Germany, the northern part of Italy. And then, of course, if we go down to the southern hemisphere, we've got Chile, we've got South Africa, and we've also got Australia and New Zealand, all able to grow and ripen Pinot Noir in a fine wine manner. So as I mentioned before, talking about grape varietals and what you like about them or what you don't like about them is a really important way to communicate about wines that you might want to try, or if you're in a wine shop, a wine that you might enjoy, and to get new recommendations. So I've blind tasted for many years. As Chris mentioned, I'm a sommelier, so part of that training is putting glasses of wine down in front of you and having to identify these wines based on what they taste and smell like. Some of it is, I know that you've probably watched the movies. Some of it is total hocus pocus. You can say, a number of different things to describe a wine and have it be correct. But there are other things that actually make up a grape varietal that are not arguable, that are actually true facts of what a wine is like. So one thing, for example, if everybody has Pinot Noir in their glass at this point, you can just take a look at the color of the wine, and you can see it's very translucent. It has a really bright, light pink rim around the top. And I know a lot of people will stare at their wine like this for a long time. But really for color, the most important thing that you can learn about a wine is you can learn how thick-skinned the grape varietal is. So Pinot Noir is a very light-skinned grape varietal, which is why it's so light in color. You're not getting a lot of extraction. You're not getting a lot of tannin from the grape skins. You're really getting this really beautiful light and lifted color that is almost translucent. When you do look at a wine that's darker in color, it could be that the skins are thicker skins. So when you're making the wine, you're getting more extraction and more color from those skins. And we'll see that in Cabernet, which is a thick skin grape varietal. But for the most part, it's based on the skins. And then the second thing would be extraction. So some people will leave the skins in with the juice to ferment for a longer amount of time to soak out more tannin and more color. And you can kind of see that in the wine as well. So if you get a Pinot Noir that's really dark in color, it probably means that they left the skins in for a very, very long time while making the wine. And you're not going to have a very light or lifted wine. You're probably going to have something that's a little bit more tannic and a little bit more firm.
Olivia, can I ask you a question there?
Yes, of course.
Do you find that some areas around the world who produce Pinot Noir tend to do that, create that more robust Pinot Noir versus the old world Burgundian style of Pinot Noir?
Absolutely. So you have to have a warmer climate in order to make that happen at all. You have to have riper grapes, and you have to have more sugar in the grape varietal or in the grapes before you press them, because that's what turns into alcohol as well. So you get these, traditionally you get these like harder skinned, maybe sunburns on the skins as well from the hot temperature. And that gets pressed in, and they'll usually leave it a longer amount of time because they're trying to make a bigger style of Pinot Noir. So for California Pinot Noir, you might hold it up next to this dainty little Burgundy that we have in our glass, which is pretty translucent, and I can already tell it's going to be pretty elegant. And that'll probably be like two different experiences altogether, because you'll have something that is more extracted, bigger body, and that's one way it's really great to be able to say, I like a fuller bodied Pinot Noir, or I like a riper, richer Pinot Noir, because that tells your sommelier what you're looking for. Or it tells your wine clerk at the store what you're looking for, and it'll usually lead you to something more in vein of New World. But even in New Zealand, I think New Zealand tends to be a little bit more Burgundian at this point as well too, with so much ocean influence to keep the grapes cooled off. So for the most part, it's really California that kind of makes the more extracted and richer styles of Pinot Noir.
Yeah, I think that's really great information. I think when I talk with a lot of members at the clubhouse, when they're trying to decide wine at dinner or at past clubs I've worked at, a fuller-bodied, usually California Pinot Noir could be a table pleaser for the typical gentleman who's having a big steak and wants a robust Cabernet, but perhaps other people at the table are looking for something a little more toned down. So for all of you guys out there, Pinot Noir has a really wide breadth of fullness to it. So I encourage you to try them out.
That's a great point. That actually leads me to my next point about moderate alcohol. So typically speaking, when you're thinking about red wine, usually we think, oh, it has a little bit more alcohol than white wine, right? A little bit boozier. So white wine is typically 11% alcohol to 13% alcohol. You have some of those really full-bodied, ripe white wines, sometimes Chardonnay from California, can be between 13 and 15%, but typically speaking, you're going to be under 13.5% alcohol. For red wines, it really starts at 12.5% alcohol, and then will go all the way up to 15.5 to 16.5% alcohol. So for Pinot Noir, we're really falling in the range of 12.5 to 14.5% alcohol. When you're seeing something that's over 14.5% alcohol for Pinot Noir, it's going to be a little hot. You're definitely going to taste a little bit more of the alcohol on the wine because it's going to be a little bit more out of balance for the grape varietal. Since we have this light body, if you put really high alcohol against the light body, it's going to overpower the wine, and you're going to taste more alcohol than you probably want to. There's medium to low tannins in Pinot Noir. So when we're talking about tannins, we're talking about when you oversteep tea and then take a sip of that black tea, it kind of dries your mouth out a little bit. This can come from the grape skins, the stems of the grapes, as well as oak barrels. So depending on how the wine's aged and depending on how the wine is made, you'll either have more or less tannins. For Pinot Noir, there is a huge debate among sommeliers what the best style of Pinot Noir is based on the stems, actually. So a lot of Burgundian winemakers will choose to take the stems off of the grapes. This is obviously more manual labor than just leaving them on. But if you take off the stems, then you're only going to be getting the juice, and it'll eliminate any underripe or bitter tannins that come from the stems. So those stems really do make a huge difference in winemaking. And if you get really nerdy about Burgundy sometime, you can really be like, can I try something that's de-stemmed and something that has stems on it, and you'll see the difference in tannin there. But typically speaking, it is a medium-low tannin wine.
I have a question, if you don't mind, about Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
So from Dr. Rosenbluth, he was wondering, does Pinot Noir age the same way that other reds do? And specifically meaning, would one typically drink older Pinot Noirs, or should they be consumed when they're younger?
That's a great question. Pinot Noir absolutely ages. It definitely will depend on where you're getting the Pinot Noir from and how it's packaged. I definitely recommend aging Pinot Noir that has a real cork top and not a screw top, because you're going to get a different characteristic from that aged wine than you probably are used to. But I actually just drank some 1991 Burgundy last week, and I was not expecting it to be as good as I thought it was going to be, or as good as it was. And once we opened it, we were all very shocked by how vibrant all of the flavors held up. There was still fruit to it. There was still a lot of tertiary characteristics, and the structure was still absolutely perfect. So there are absolutely Pinot Noirs that you can age for as long as you would age your Cabernet. Okay, so another thing that's really not arguable about wine tasting Pinot Noir is what kind of fruit characteristics you get. There will almost always be red fruit characteristics in your wine. So when you are, smelling your Pinot Noir or tasting Pinot Noir, people will often say strawberries, red cherry. All of these are totally correct answers, but it is usually a more light red fruited characteristic. From there, you can get into, depending on what region it's from, whether it's underripe red fruit, which would come from a colder climate, or stewed red fruit, which would probably come from California, just depending on how much heat the grapes have gotten before the wine is made. Typically speaking, Pinot Noir is aged in French oak. So that'll present itself in kind of baking spices or vanilla, but it's not a characteristic of the grape varietal itself. It's a characteristic of the aging. Finally, we can drink some wine. So for those of you who have picked up the wines that we're having this evening, we have the Bourgogne de Ronceville from Domaine Arlode. And then as a comparison, we also have Willamette Valley Averain from Oregon. I think these are really fun to taste next to each other, of course, because we have both Old World and New World. But we, in the New World, Oregon is one of the most similar places to Burgundy, and a lot of those winemakers try to make wine in a similar way. So we'll start with the Bourgogne Rouge, the Ronceville.
So at this point, everyone, I do have everyone muted. If you're using a computer, if you touch your space bar, it's almost like a push to talk. So if anybody wants to share some of the characteristics that they are experiencing when they're tasting the Old World red versus the Old World Pinot Noir versus the New World one from Oregon.
I do want to note one thing about the wine you're tasting first, the Rancevie. This is 100% Gevrey-Chambertin fruit. So typically when you see a Bourgogne Rouge, it can be from anywhere in Burgundy. The one I've chosen is specifically from Gevrey-Chambertin and is right next to Chambertin-Griot, which is a Premier Cru site. So this fruit is really excellent and made by a producer who makes a lot of Grand Cru wines. So a really excellent find for quality versus dollar amount.
We have one question from the group. Alexis was wondering, can Pinot Noirs be chilled and should they be chilled? And can you talk about that along all red wines?
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I put all of my reds in the fridge about 15 minutes before I opened them this evening. I'm a stickler for temperature in red wine, especially when it's getting warm outside. I really think that it's going to be flabby and not as refreshing if you're drinking anything over 65 degrees. So typically speaking, I like to put almost all of my, I'm going to take that back. I put all of my reds in kind of a cellar temperature, which would be between 57 and 65 degrees. So if you put your, put any red in the fridge for 10 minutes before you drink it, especially if you're taking it outside, then you'll achieve a better tasting experience that's not hot. And usually the warmer the wine is, the more unwanted characteristics come out about it. So alcohol is easier to identify on a warmer wine. So it might taste a little more alcoholic than usual. But chilling red is definitely recommended. If you have a really light-bodied red, like maybe a Beaujolais, which is made from Gamay, you can definitely drink that completely chilled on a summer day outside, and it's just like a little bit more of a full-bodied rosé. So.
And there are some really fun sparkling reds out of Italy that are wonderful to have celebratory-wise for red sparkling that are delicious chilled too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you've been able to taste the Rancevie at this point, for me, I'm getting a lot of underripe red fruit. It's like tart cherries and tart strawberries. And then I also get a little bit of minerality, which is a scary word sometimes because what does that even mean? But for me at this moment, I'm getting a little bit of like, maybe some like wet rocks when you're hiking, you kind of smell that wet rock note. I get that in this wine. Yeah, right off the top, get a little bit of that, that like wet rock. This is all aged in older oak. So I do get a little bit of baking spice as well, or like a hint of nutmeg. But really, I think this wine is very light and lifted. It has really bright acidity to make it refreshing. So if you're tasting this wine and you're like, I don't know that I really like it, that's absolutely fine. But think about what it is that you might not like about it or what it is that you do like about it. So if you like that lifted acidity and that brightness, or if you don't like that lifted acidity and brightness, or you want a little bit more body to it, then that's something to note for your future in wine tasting to say, oh, I've had some red Burgundy before. It was a little too acidic for me, or it was a little too light-bodied for me. Or you can say, I've had it before and I liked it. I want something a little bit earthier. And then from there, people are able to make new recommendations for you and guide you down another path. So our second wine here is going to be the Averain. So you can already see the color of this is a little bit darker than the first one. And again, that's because we're moving into the New World and it is a little bit warmer in Willamette than it is in Burgundy.
Were these particularly good years for those regions?
2017 it's been very warm and untraditionally warm in France. One of the things that I always like to say about Burgundy is that every vintage is a good vintage for a very good winemaker. And Domaine Arlot is certainly that. So 2018 was an exemplary vintage. 2017 was very good, but it's been very warm there. So there's been a lot of adapting to the winemaking. So picking grapes a little bit earlier, and, you know, coming up with ideas on how to make the best wine that they possibly can in new climate circumstances. For Oregon, we're drinking the 2018, and 2018, I was actually just there last year tasting some of the 2018s out of barrel before they were put in bottle, and 2018 was a very excellent vintage. So for me, the comparison between the two, the Avarain is definitely more vibrant red fruit on the nose. I get like riper cherry. So we're starting to move more toward that fruit-forward characteristic of the New World. I would say for Old World or Burgundy, like we were just drinking, the fruit is there, but it's a little bit in the background of the wine. And for this one, it's a little bit more in the front and kind of the center of attention. So this is definitely more of that kind of ripe red cherry, and another characteristic of New World Pinot Noir is more of an earthy characteristic, but in a different way. So we talked a little bit about minerality in the last one, and this one I smell a little bit more of like potting soil or like wet dirt. In a very good way, and that characteristic is usually in the New World. When you're blind tasting a wine, you usually think about, am I getting fruit on the forefront? Is that the main attention? Because that's probably a New World wine. But also, if you're getting more of the potting soil or mushrooms, then you're getting minerality and crushed stone. Then it's also probably going to be a New World wine. Any questions before we move on?
Olivia, you mentioned the heat and how it affected, for example, in these two wines, the 2017 versus the 2018 vintages. How do you think climate change and global warming is affecting wines, and in particular, how it affects Old World versus New World wines?
Well, I think currently, I mean, the state is, we're definitely trying to find ways to maintain the regions that we love and be able to still make wine in those areas. So again, picking earlier to maintain the acidity and not make wines that are too overtly ripe or overripe. But we're also, I mean, people are planting grapes in places that they never thought that they would be planting grapes, New World and Old World. So I think Germany is doing a great job of adapting. We'll talk a lot about Riesling next week and German wine, but some of my very good friends make wine in Germany, and we've had many conversations about growing more Pinot Noir, which has always been grown in Germany, but as their main red grape varietal. But now that they're starting to see warmer temperatures, it makes a little more sense to grow a little bit more red wine than maybe they used to. And then I think there's also Southern London is focusing a lot on sparkling wine, and they're a little bit cooler than traditional champagne. But since the temperatures are warming up, they're actually making some decent champagne out of that area right now. I'm sorry, sparkling wine out of that area, but in the style of champagne. So.
Yeah, you're definitely right. Actually, just a few years ago, I did a wine dinner at another club with sparkling wines all from Southern London, and it was really unique to have them come out of that region. And this was probably 2016 or 2017, but members at my former club really enjoyed it. So that's another fun thing, a unique geographical region to find delicious.
Yeah, I think people are trying to be creative and come up with the best ideas that they can. And a lot of people have thought far enough ahead to already have vineyards in England that are 10 plus years old. and have already made wines that have aged for 5 years in order to make really fine wines that are sparkling. So it's also interesting to kind of see how big winemakers are thinking about the future and thinking about where they might be making wine in 10 years.
Yeah. I have another question from someone in the group. They're wondering, how long can we drink from an open bottle of wine, particularly Pinot Noir, but any wine? How long do they typically last? I can tell you what we do at the club, but I'd like to hear what you say.
Every wine is a little bit different. My general rule is I refrigerate it, first of all, even if it's red. Put your red wine, put a cork in it, put it in the refrigerator, take it out 20 minutes before you want to drink it the next day. That'll definitely help maintain the freshness a little bit longer. But I would really say 3 days for reds, typically speaking. If you have wine that has some residual sugar in it, for example, Riesling, those might last a little bit longer, so about a week. And then when we're thinking about dessert wines, like port or sherry, those can also last a little bit longer because they're typically fortified and have higher alcohol to preserve the wines. So week and a half to 2 weeks.
Right. Yeah. That's very good. And luckily at the Harmonie Club, we have a lot of members who love to drink wine at the bar. So typically we don't have a bottle open for more than 3 days.
Good.
Some smiling faces out there. You know who you are. But so that's great. But we do occasionally open up wines that we don't finish the bottles, and so we have to get rid of them. It's one of the reasons, if any of you have talked to James in the restaurant about it, but last year we rolled out our Cruvenet selections on our wine list for wines that are stored in our Cruvenet with nitrogen tanks, and that helps decrease the oxidization of the wines. Which helps also make them last longer. And and there's lots of other things that people can buy at home, like the what's the gun with the little cartridges?
Now that you said it, it slipped my mind completely.
Coravin. So and they've gotten a lot better, I'd say, over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, when I was tasting wines with wine reps with Coravins, they go through cartridges very quickly and they're expensive, but they've gotten much better. So if anyone has some really great bottles of wine at home and it's, you don't want to open the whole bottle, you're by yourself or whatnot, for whatever reason, investing in a Coravin is a really great tool. It puts a needle into the cork, and using a cartridge of gas, it sucks the wine out and doesn't allow the oxygen to go into the bottle. So I will
say, if you do use a Coravin, though, don't use it on items that you plan on continuing to cellar. So many people I know, when the Coravin was first coming out, they were like, this is going to be amazing. Now I can go down to my cellar and check in on wines and see how they're doing and see what's drinkable now, what needs to be aged a little longer. But as you do that more and more, you might open that bottle and find that it's actually spoiled because it had been opened for too long. So definitely do it if you plan on keeping a bottle for 2 weeks or a month by yourself. Don't do it if you're going to cellar it for more than that time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great recommendation. I think a lot of people, like you said, go down the wrong track and think they can keep it forever. And for all of you guys out there watching, we have another video coming up later this week with yours truly about barrel aging your spirits and cocktails at home. And that's one of the things that I talk about. If you have any great scotches or whiskeys at home with just a few ounces left, maybe saving it for a special occasion, it's not really doing you any good because the alcohol can still evaporate in the bottle. So the more air in the bottle, the quicker you need to drink it. So anyway.
Okay, moving on. We spent a long time on Pinot Noir. That's one of my personal favorite grapes. The history goes on forever. So hopefully we'll make it through the next a little bit quicker. But okay, so Merlot is the second noble grape varietal that we're going to talk about today. Instead of doing a Merlot tasting, we're going to do a Merlot and Cabernet blend from Bordeaux versus Cabernet next. So the first mention of Merlot is, of course, in Bordeaux in the 1700s. And Merlot is a blending grape. It has always been king blending grape. It's really wonderful because it really softens up Cabernet, which is a much sturdier, hardier grape. And so those two go like two peas in a pod, are perfect for making wine together. Merlot wasn't really made as a single varietal wine, aside from one very famous right bank producer in Bordeaux, until it came over to the United States and started getting bottled with Merlot on the label. Most people associate with Merlot with, again, the right bank. It's very famous for making up the majority of the blend that goes into the right bank in Bordeaux. So if we're thinking about Bordeaux, all of the famous first growths come from the left bank, which are all primarily Cabernet Sauvignon, blended with Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, which the Cabernet that we're tasting today has some Petit Verdot in it, as well as Malbec, and back in the day, before it was extinct in Bordeaux, Carmenere. There's also been some challenges growing Merlot, as for a long time they were getting a lot of rot in that area. Bordeaux, again, is right on this river. It's right on the Gironde and the Dudignon, which is great because that's how they were able to make their wine so famous and trade it to so many other countries. But with all of the rain that they were getting from the ocean, Merlot was having a hard time not rotting. So starting in the 1960s, they were seeing a lot of rot for Merlot specifically. Luckily, in Bordeaux, they had many other grape varietals to make up the blend, and they were able to adjust and continue making excellent wine. But during the 1970s, they actually had to put a ban on growing Merlot because it was all rotting. So again, another kind of challenging grape to grow. It definitely needs enough sunlight and a warmer climate than Pinot Noir, but does still make up some of the most famous wines in the world. Due to the demand, we saw a huge bump in the 1970s of Merlot. So everybody started seeing Merlot listed on the bottle. It's known for being very silky and jammy and easy to drink, which is, all those things are absolutely true. And so California and Washington grow all of the best Merlots that are coming out of our country. And then let's not forget about Italy. Sure that you guys have heard the phrase super Tuscan thrown around a time or two. So in the 1800s, Merlot also spread into Tuscany and started being blended in with Sangiovese. Similar story happened with Cabernet Sauvignon, which we'll touch on a little bit in the next segment about Cabernet. But basically, people wanted to make their Sangiovese, which is another light-skinned grape varietal like Pinot Noir, a little bit richer and bigger in body, and more like Bordeaux. So they started importing international grape varietals from France to make their wine a little bit more full-bodied. And now you can find Merlot blended in some of the most famous Super Tuscans out of Italy as well. It was also thought that Merlot spread to Chile. So there's a very famous story that Chile was growing a lot of Merlot for quite some time. And back in the 80s, Robert Mondavi, famed winemaker from California, took a little trip down, saw the grapes, and they were like, this is not Merlot. And then they came to find out that it was the long lost grape Carmenere, which had disappeared from Bordeaux, and is now Chile's main grape varietal, or most famous grape varietal. So not Merlot, but they are related and are very similar in many ways. Merlot lost its steam in the 90s. And then, of course, I'm sure most of you remember the movie Sideways, where he says that he is not drinking any Merlot. This made a huge impact on younger generations of wine drinkers. And we have very much steered away from drinking Merlot. So it's kind of been on its way out for quite some time. But again, in blends, Merlot is one of the best grape varietals to have. It really softens it up, makes some of the best blends in the world. And don't get me wrong, there are certainly very good Merlots still made in the world. A couple examples of some of the best Merlots that are still being made in the world. Chateau Cheval Blanc has been known as a right bank Bordeaux maker who used 100% Merlot in multiple vintages. Petrus is mostly Merlot, and of course Ornellaia. So the characteristics of Merlot, we're not going to taste this right now to talk about it, but we will as soon as we finish with Cabernet, talk a little bit about the blends. So Merlot means little blackbird. This is a blue-fruited, try to say that 20 times fast, grape varietal. So when we think about blue-fruited grape varietals, there's really only two grapes that it could be, and that's Syrah and Merlot. So it's very plummy. A lot of people describe it as being very plummy or plum skin or ripe plum. And then when you think about Syrah, you think more blueberry. But not a lot of grape varietals are primarily blue-fruited. This is definitely grown in warmer regions, like I already mentioned. Rot has been a really big part of the grape's history. And because of that warmer climate, as we talked about a little bit with Pinot Noir, when you have a warmer climate, you get more of those, more of the sugars during ripening, and it develops more of a cooked fruit or jammy or stewed fruit characteristic, just because the heat is impacting the flavors in the grape in that way when they're getting warmer. It ripens very quickly, so again, with the rot, it can be a really challenging grape varietal to grow. And when it's underripe, you can have some more characteristics similar to Cabernet, which we'll talk about in a second, but more of the green notes like tobacco, green pepper, or a little bit of a grassy note. But I think green tobacco is really the best way I can possibly describe it when I'm tasting Merlot. And that, again, it can come from the skins or the stems, that kind of underripe characteristic. It is lower in tannin and acidity than Cabernet, which is why it's so easy drinking. And it's also, it's about the same amount of alcohol as Cabernet, so usually right around that 15% mark. Often aged in French oak, and again, described as silky, chocolatey, easy drinking. Every time I blind taste Merlot, I take a sip of it and I'm like, this is so full-bodied and easy to drink. And I'm like, it has to be Merlot. It can't be anything else. So I think that's a very cool characteristic about Merlot.
Olivia, we had one question going back a little bit. You had mentioned Super Tuscan, and Merlot is typically blended to make Super Tuscans, but can you talk a little bit more about what exactly a Super Tuscan is? It's stuff coming from Mrs. Weinberg.
So Tuscany, the main grape varietal that is grown there is Sangiovese. There have been, if you think about Chianti, in the old world, they don't label with the grape varietal, which is why it can be really challenging for Americans to understand wine or to order wine correctly. A lot of people will say, I'll have a Sancerre, and when somebody says, we don't have Sancerre, but we have Sauvignon Blanc, they're like, no, I said Sancerre. But those are the same thing, because Sauvignon Blanc is the only thing that's grown in Sancerre. So when we're thinking about Chianti, it's always going to be Sangiovese. Chianti is one of the main areas in Tuscany, and the other one would be Montalcino, which is where we get Brunello di Montalcino. And so they all make Sangiovese there. So back in the day, they wanted to start making wine in a richer style to compete with French wines and with fine wines from France. And they figured the only way to do that was to make these like fuller bodied wines. So they started importing Merlot, basically Bordeaux varietals. So Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, a little bit of Cabernet Franc, but not really. And they started blending those with Sangiovese to make a wine that's called a Super Tuscan. The phrase Super Tuscan, you'll never see it on a bottle of wine because it's not a sanctioned term. it'll say Toscano on the label. It'll say IGT Toscano. The Italians are big sticklers for wine laws. And since you're not using indigenous grape varietals from Italy, it's not included in the DOC or the DOCG, which is the governing area or the governing people that oversee the wine laws in Italy. So instead, there's this lower level called IGT, in Indicación Geográfica Típica, which is basically just saying where it's from. And so they're able to put Toscana or Tuscany on the label, but it will never say, sorry, it's a little bit loud here. It'll never say Super Tuscan on the label.
That's really interesting. And however, people should know that they will a lot of times find the word Super Tuscan on wine menus.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so for people like me who are making wine menus, a lot of times we will put Super Tuscan on the list like we have at the Harmonie Club. And that's so that people know right away that it's a blend, because so many of the other sections of our wine list or the bottles themselves are listed by the varietal. It's difficult to have a place to put those blended wines from Tuscany. So it's an easy kind of catch-all.
I will say one other interesting fact about Super Tuscans is the original Cabernet grapes were a gift from a prince marrying a princess in Tuscany. And so that's how they originally started growing those grape varietals there. So there is one region in Italy that is able to blend in Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc and still be DOCG, and is in Tuscany, and that's called Carmignano. So it's a very, very small appellation, but it was originally a gift from France.
So Olivia, we're just past 7 o'clock. So I think for a Cabernet, perhaps we'll zoom through it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quicker. And then I do have some other questions from the private chat for a short Q&A session.
Perfect. Cabernet Sauvignon, everybody has had it. Everybody knows it well. It is an American staple. So it can literally be found everywhere in the world, from Canada to Lebanon. Some of those places grow it better than others. I won't say which ones. Bordeaux is the birthplace. And of course, as I just mentioned with our long talk about Super Tuscans, it spread to Piedmont and Tuscany in the 1800s. And then Cabernet was planted in Australia, who still has one of the oldest vineyards in the entire world. So at Penfolds, if you're familiar, that's a misspelling, I apologize. P-E-N, Penfolds. Has one of the oldest vineyards in the entire world that is still growing the same Cabernet grapes from 1832. Post-Prohibition, just like Pinot Noir is how America got its foot in the door with Cabernet Sauvignon. At the same time that Pinot Noir was making its comeback, Cabernet was really getting its foot in there, and they were finding that Napa was making some of the best Cabernet in the world because of how quickly they can ripen it and how warm it is with this valley that has really fantastic fog to cool it down. And this is called a diurnal shift. So when we're thinking about nighttime temperatures versus daytime temperatures, that big shift between how cold it gets at night and how warm it is and during the day is great for acidity in the wine. So Napa Valley gets really cold at night. You have to wear a jacket. During the day, you're out there at 70, 80 degrees. It feels fantastic. But that shift is fantastic for Cabernet. The major thing that put us on the map internationally for Cabernet Sauvignon was the 1976 Judgment of Paris. There are many movies about it and books about it. It's a great story. But basically, we went up blind against some of the best wines from France. And what do you know? Some of our wines actually won. So that's how we really got put on the map for Cabernet. Today, like I mentioned, you can find Cabernet anywhere. It's grown in Lebanon. It's grown in France. It's grown in Spain. It's grown in China now. And it really does well wherever there is a warm climate. But the really special thing about every single one of the grapes that we've tasted this evening is that it really tastes different based on where it's grown. So even though we do have Cabernet as a really huge international grape, you can still really taste the difference between when it's grown in Australia and when it's grown in France and when it's grown in America, and that's because of the outside characteristics of where it's grown. So in Australia, there's eucalyptus around it, and there's this gum tree that actually gives it a minty characteristic based on where it's grown. In France, it's a little bit chillier. You're going to have more acidity in it. In California, it's super, super hot. That's where we get these riper, richer, bigger flavors and higher alcohol. So that terroir is really driving the grape varietal and has us tasting a number of different styles of Cabernet. The characteristics of Cabernet, as a grape varietal itself, just so everybody knows, Cabernet is often blended with other grape varietals. So when you're picking up red fruit in Cabernet, it's probably because it's blended with something else. In the United States, if it's labeled Cabernet Sauvignon, it only has to be 75% Cabernet Sauvignon. So it can still be blended with 25% of other grapes. For example, the Cabernet that we're tasting today has 10% Petit Verdot blended in, but it's still Cabernet Sauvignon. So these other characteristics might come from something else, but Cabernet by itself is black fruited. So black cassis, blackberry, black cherry, and it's mostly known for pyrazines. In some grape varietals, we'll talk about pyrazines again next week with Sauvignon Blanc. But with some grape varietals, there are actual enzymes that are created in the grape varietal that are actually found in other foods or other organisms and make them smell the same. So a pyrazine is a smell or a characteristic that you would also find in bell peppers, cilantro, as well as it's in grass. It's in what else? It's in a lot of herbs. But it is an actual enzyme that you can pick up on the nose. So with a lot of Cabernets, usually it goes away with a little bit of age, but with a lot of young Cabernets, you can pick up on this kind of green note, which is a huge characteristic of Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet usually has higher tannin, high acidity, it's full-bodied, it is high alcohol, and it's often aged in oak. So it is like everything on high to the max. It has all of the flavor and all of the characteristics. One thing that I always like to say about Cabernet, I think Cabernet is usually everyone's first, or at least from my generation of wine drinkers, it's usually everybody's first love as far as grape varietals go. And I think that's because it is so turned up, the volume is so turned up on everything, that it's really easy to understand and easy to pick out at least one or two characteristics that you would like about the wine. You don't have to really go digging in the glass and be like, okay, what else am I smelling? I'm only smelling red fruit. You really like, oh, this is full of black fruit. This is full to the max, and you just get a huge nose full of characteristics. So I think Cabernet is usually one of the first wines that people turn to when they're getting into wine. Okay. Our last two wines. So here we have Lely Cabernet Sauvignon. This is a Napa Valley wine. So I think as time moves on, we've already seen a huge increase in Napa Valley pricing, and it's been harder and harder to find bottles of wine that are labeled Napa Valley and not just California, and are labeled Cabernet that are under like $50. It's getting more challenging and more challenging because that land is getting more expensive and it's getting really challenging to make wine there for a good price. So this is one of my favorite affordable Cabernets in California because it's from one of the best appellations and it's labeled Napa Valley, but it still doesn't break the bank. So this is made by Lely Heron from the Heron family. And then we also have a Bordeaux. This is not coming from the right or left bank like we talked about. It's truly a blend from Bordeaux, which is why it's just labeled Bordeaux and not one of the smaller appellations. So it's from Entre de Mer, which is an area, it's in between the rivers, is basically what it means in French. So 2018 Bordeaux, and this is primarily Merlot, so 60% Merlot, and then blended with Cabernet Petit Verdot. So similar blending to the Lely, but we'll see the difference between it being mostly Merlot and being mostly Cabernet.
And again, I encourage anyone, you're all muted, but you can use your space bar in your computer as a push to talk. That will unmute you if you have a question, or you can ask me a question in the private chat. Or if you want to share what characteristics you are tasting. Since this is our last part of the tasting, and I know, not sure if people have dinner plans or whatnot, but I thought we could get to some of the other questions that we've received in the chat, if that's okay with you, Olivia.
Absolutely.
So someone asked, how long did it take you to become a sommelier?
That's a great question. It took me 3 years, which is a very small amount of time compared to how much time most people study for. I became a sommelier when I was 24 years old, which is the same year that I took over my first wine program.
Young to become a sommelier.
Very young. It's very young to be a sommelier.
Yeah.
I was really lucky when I was 21 in my first restaurant job to be working under a master of wine who saw that I was very good at selling wine. So he wanted to actually give me some knowledge behind it to be able to make educated recommendations to my guests. And so I took a class with him, and from there, it really just opened up Pandora's box, and I've never been able to learn enough. There's still so many things I don't know, and the more you know you don't know.
That's right. Yes, yeah. So we're also wondering, what have you been drinking lately? I know it's warmer weather, but generally speaking, what are your go-to wines? What are your favorite red and whites?
Favorite red and whites. I'm going to start with white because that's the easiest for me. I drink a lot of white wine. I think over the years, the more wine that I drink, the more I want it to just be refreshing and just a delight to have, and not too intellectual at the end of my day. It's really fun to sit down and peel apart very small nuances of wines, but when I get home to my apartment, I'm like, I just want something easy and crushable and very delicious. And Riesling has always been my Riesling and Champagne are my two favorite wines to drink as well.
I'm here.
So Riesling we'll talk about next week, but there are a lot of dry styles that are really charming and not too high in alcohol, and just bright and refreshing. That when I get home, I usually like to have a cold glass of Riesling. And then Champagne. I know Champagne is not the most affordable thing to drink on an everyday basis, but there are tons of sparkling wines that are being made in a Champagne method that you can buy for under $20 that are absolutely delicious, like Reventos Cava. There's some really fun things coming out of Portugal that are made in a traditional style that you can get for under $20. So on a normal basis, I drink a lot of sparkling wine and a lot of Riesling. For reds, I would say the thing I mostly have in my personal cellar is probably red Burgundy. It's not an everyday wine by any means. It's a treat anytime I get to open it up. But for a regular drinking day, I like to drink a lot of Raúl Pérez's wines from Spain. They're very refreshing. They're made from Mencia, and they're also very affordable. And I also like to drink a lot of Gamay or Beaujolais, so those kind of lighter-bodied, more refreshing styles of red wine.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'm a big white wine drinker too, all year long. Riesling gets a bad rap. I know you, just from you and I talking a lot, definitely love Rieslings, and I'm a sparkling guy too. So those are my go-to refreshing things as well. So, what do you think is an upcoming region or wine that we should be looking out for?
Ooh, there is so much going on in the wine world. That's such a hard question. This year alone, I think, so Chile has been on the forefront of winemaking for quite some time. There's a gentleman named Pedro Parra in the area who's a very talented winemaker, but also like a soil specialist who's traveled around the world and given a lot of people feedback on what to do better in their vineyards. He got a lot of press this year in the New York Times for some of his Pais, which I mentioned earlier as that mission grape that was originally grown in Mexico. So I think that Chilean wines are certainly getting better and better, and they're finding better ways to use their land. I think that the cheap side of Chile, like a lot of countries that are imported into the United States, are not the best wines. The ones that you get for $12 that say Chile on it, like some of them are good and some of that's fine. But really, when you're looking at the really cool things coming out of a country for the first time, they're always going to be a little more expensive because they're a little more experimental. So some of those more experimental blends coming out of Chile are very cool. I think sparkling wine from other regions. We have one from Hungary that we just picked up in our portfolio recently. That was very good. I also know that there's a lot of California producers that are really focused on making high quality champagne-like sparkling wines. So there's a couple that have gotten a huge cult following over the past 5-6 years, like Ultramarine and Under the Wire, that you really have to get on these mailing lists to be able to get it. It's super nerdy, and you have to go and sign up and then get your allocation as soon as it comes out. But for those of us that have been following that movement, there are other very talented winemakers that are moving in that direction. And it's actually caught the eye of Pierre Peters from Champagne, who is one of my favorite champagne producers. He is now going to do a project in Santa Barbara with Tyler. So there's just a lot of really cool sparkling wine ideas and projects coming out of the United States right now that I think are going to make high-end sparklers from the United States a bigger trend for sure.
Awesome. That's a great thing to look out for. What do you think? One of the questions I wrote down, you had just mentioned a highly allocated wine. You and I deal with that type of thing when we talk about buying wines for a business. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between what people would see in a liquor store versus what most people will see in a club or a restaurant, what you and I would typically say on-premise versus off-premise wines?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I now on the side where I am a provider of wines to businesses. I deal with both liquor stores and restaurants. And so many times people will come to me and they'll say, can I get some Turley? Or can I get some Mayacamas? And those wines are wines that are made for restaurants, and that's how they're divvied up. So if you find them in liquor stores, then it's probably because they do a very big amount of business with the company supplying them. But it's not a usual thing. So when we think about Mayacamas, for example, which is a cult Cabernet, which is made in a very old school style out of California, it's very, very good. Gets high reviews and scores every vintage. They actually, they do not allow for the sale of their wines online from liquor stores when they're purchased. So there's a lot of kind of back end stuff that goes on with these cult-like allocated wines, to where they want it to be that you can only find them on restaurant lists because they want them to be sought after and regarded as fine wines. So that's kind of where that comes in. And a lot of California wines are that way. For example, you won't find Sandlands, which is a small cult following trendy hipster sommelier winery. You won't find those wines ever in a shop. They will always be on the coolest restaurants' wine lists in New York City.
So you and I have to talk more about that then.
Yeah.
I think that's really good to know. And for a lot of members, when they come to the clubhouse and they look at the wine list, and when they go out to other restaurants as well, and there are other clubs that they might be members of, what me and my colleagues do a lot of times in restaurants on our side and menu design is to make sure that we're finding those on-premise wines, things that are unique that you can only get when you come to a restaurant and hopefully when you come to mine. Versus something that you can see in the liquor store all the time. And
and those wines are also what make our jobs fun. Being able to pour those for guests and talk about them with guests, instead of saying, here's the Bogle Merlot that I got at the liquor store last week, but I also have it on my wine list. Not as much fun to talk about.
Yeah.
But when you're saying, I was able to get this bottle of Cheval Blanc, which you're definitely not going to find in a liquor store, and serve it to a guest and make their evening and help them celebrate a special occasion. It really puts the cherry on top of what we do.
Absolutely. I have a question from the Cohens. They want to know, can you talk, or what are your thoughts on Sonoma Valley wine versus the Santa Barbara region?
That's a great question. So Santa Barbara actually only became a recognized appellation in 2003. So it is a super young and up and coming region. I'm very lucky to say that one of my close sommelier friends, and a very famous sommelier, makes wine in that region. And I went and stayed with him for a week last year and got to see everything in Santa Barbara. It's very, it's not developed yet. I mean, it's everything is still being done in warehouses. It is not flashy and showy like you get when you go up to Napa and Sonoma. Napa and Sonoma are the two most historical places to go visit in the United States for wine. But if we're talking about drinking wise, I think there's a lot of very cool projects happening in Santa Barbara. The land is less expensive. It's a little bit cooler there. Obviously, it's much farther. It's a little bit warmer there than Sonoma. It's much farther south, but it still stays pretty cool. But they're actually able to grow a lot of grapes there that you're really not able to grow in Sonoma. So in Santa Barbara, there's a Grenache project that I am a very big fan of, called A Tribute to Grace. And she has 4 vineyards of Grenache, and that's it. And those wines are absolutely charming and delicious, but you wouldn't be able to get the same ripeness that you would need in Sonoma as you would in Santa Barbara. So there's more grape varietals being experimented with and being planted. Sonoma is the perfect place in California for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and that's why they have such huge names for wineries. Kistler is there, Chalk Hill is there, Hirsch is there, Ant Hill Farms. There's so many other cool things happening there as well. And for California, most of the forefront of the winemakers, or the younger winemakers at this point, are now trying to make wine in that Burgundian style. So you really kind of are seeing more of a wave to getting kind of back to that lighter style. And in Santa Barbara, it's kind of its own thing. There's no history there of making those bigger oakier styles of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And there's no, new generation, because it's all the new generation currently. There's no history. So people are really still deciding kind of what grows best there. There's Albarino being grown there, Grenache Blanc, of course, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Gamay, Merlot. So there's a lot of stuff happening there right now. And I think that's one of the cool things about Santa Barbara, is that it's still being experimented with, and there's still a lot of room to figure out what wines will be the best from that area.
So we're just coming up on 7:30. I have 2 or 3 more questions. So this is, we have just a few more questions from the chat. I know, I think, Mr. Mendelbaum, you raised your hand. Unmute yourself. You can go for it.
Oh, thank you. Great presentation tonight. Very enjoyable. Really was very nice. So I got a question. You mentioned Kistler. Have you tried his new Pinot Noir?
Absolutely, yeah. So I actually work with Kistler
wow.
as one of my brands. Yes, so I have tried the new Pinot Noir.
Occidental, right?
Yes. Yep. So it's from the Occidental Vineyard sites. And honestly, those wines are a little bit less expensive than the Kistler, much less allocated. And they drink like a traditional Kistler wine.
Great. Okay. Did that answer your question, Mr. Mendenbaum?
Michael,
Yeah.
yes, I don't want to take up everybody's time. There's a million questions.
No,
But
no.
have you had anything from Mount Etna?
Yes, Mount Etna is one of my favorite southern Italian regions. It's on volcanic soil, which is similar to the region that we just talked about, Willamette. That's on volcanic soil as well. But it's one of the only regions that's still an active volcano. So you really get this really lovely volcanic presence in the wine, or kind of, it's in that like earthy category, but in more of a smoky flavor. And they're making really lovely lighter bodied wines from grapes that you don't find anywhere else in Italy. Nerello Mascalese, as well as Frappato. And then the whites are also very cool, very mineral driven, and also a little smoky. So really interesting wines, great food pairings.
Great, thank you.
Italy is actually one of my favorite places. For those of you who look at the wine list at I was about to say at work, at the Harmonie Club, you'll see there's now been a much larger presence of Italian wines. I gravitate towards Italian wines because I think that it's a country where you can get an amazing bang for your buck, and an amazing geographical region that has such a wide breadth of varietals offered. So that's my personal recommendation. And I always tell everyone I have an Irish heart and an Italian stomach, so anything that comes out of Italy I usually like. But I have a few more questions from the group here. What reds need to be decanted? I have a rule for my staff, but I'd love to hear what you say.
So fuller bodied wines that are young, definitely. For example, this Bordeaux could certainly use a decanter to soften up some of the tannins and bring a little bit of oxygen into those fruit flavors. When wine has been in a bottle, basically it changes completely once it touches oxygen. And that's why a lot of times we'll drink from such large glasses, is because there's more space on the top and more surface area for your wine to interact with oxygen. Once it interacts with oxygen, in the air above it is where those different characteristics in the esters, that is where we get our aroma come from. So in this like layer above, like when I go like this, I'm releasing a bunch more esters into this area of the wine glass, and I'm able to smell more of the wine. And smelling is the whole thing of wine, because if you plug your nose and you drink it, you can't taste anything. So really, the whole experience of wine is through your nose. So for wines like this, you definitely want to have a little more aeration, a little more oxygen. I always decant my young Burgundies as well. I always think, I think like young red wines typically can use a decanter. And then also wines with sediment in it. So anything that is over, I'm basically saying all red wines, but I'm not. So most wines that are full bodied that are over 10 years old will develop some sediment in the bottom of the bottle. And the real reason that we started decanting wine is so that we could drink our wines without getting sediment in our glass. So wines that are a little bit older, like 10-year-old Cabernet, for example, will probably have some sediment and need to be decanted. And that's when you decant in a way where you're keeping the sediment out of the decanter. When you have a young Burgundy or a young Bordeaux, you're doing it for a completely different reason, and that's to get aeration. And that's when you really want to just dump it down into the bottle and get more oxygen into the decanter and into the wine before drinking it.
Great answer. Yes, good. We have one last question before we end, and that was, what is the best way to taste? I was taught to take a sip first and swallow it, and then a small sip, and then take a second sip and let that give you the full mouthfeel. What would your recommendation be to those individuals who are looking to taste wines and get everything out of it at home?
The first thing I always do is, like I mentioned before, I always look at the color a little bit to kind of get my expectations on what I'm tasting. Am I tasting something light, or am I tasting something a little bit richer? Before I start swirling my glass, I always just put my nose in it like this. If I can smell it right here in this area, it's an aromatic grape varietal. that gives me some clues as to what I'm drinking. If I put my nose up to it and I can't smell it that high out of the glass without swirling it, then I'm probably drinking a more neutral grape varietal like Pinot Grigio. So there are things that that kind of give me a little more information. So when I am tasting, before I do anything, I just kind of give it a little smell. And then I really kind of mix it up and swirl it a lot so that I can really get all those esters and all those characteristics. So then I give it a smell, and I spend a little time smelling it because, again, the whole experience of wine is through your nose. The only thing that happens on your palate is tannin, acid, body. It's just structure. So everything is flavor-wise is happening through your nose. So I kind of do that before I take any characteristics of the wine onto my palate. The first sip, you are totally right. It does shock your palate. If I'm tasting in a formal setting, I'll take my first sip, I'll spend a little time with it, and then I'll spit it out. Of course, if I'm not in a formal setting, then I will not spit it out and I will swallow it. And then the second taste is really where you're going to be able to make more conclusions about this wine. So if you take one sip of wine and you say, oh, I don't like that, take a second sip and settle in with it for a second to see if that's actually true, because it could be that it's your first sip of wine for the day, or you weren't expecting that much acidity, or you weren't expecting that much tannin, but the second sip is actually more delightful than the first one. So the second sip is where I really spend time taking in the structure of the wine, because that's the whole point of putting it in my mouth. So that's where I kind of look at acidity and tannin and body and alcohol. But for the most part, I get all of my tasting notes or my ideas of what the wine tastes like from my nose.
Great advice. So I think that wraps it up. We don't have any more questions in the chat. I'm so appreciative of you taking all this time to be with us. I'm going to unmute everyone so we can give you a big round of applause.
Yeah.
Very nice job.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Very good job, Olivia. We're
Thank
super
you.
that you could be here with us tonight.
Thank you. And hopefully I'll see you all next week to talk about white wine.
We'll be there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.